We got to talk about the attack in Dagestan because, you know, Putin said that this can't happen in Russia. We must all be dreaming. We must not have seen what we've seen, which is 20 people being killed, including 15 police officers, in two separate but simultaneous terror attacks in Makachiklia, which I believe is the capital. I'm very bad at pronouncing it. Close enough, though. And Durban, I think it's Derbent, in the south of the country of Dagestan, which used to be a place in Russia that had a lot more terrorism during the late 90s and early 2000s. But after multiple Russian operations in Dagestan and in Chechnya, the Russians declared that basically the need to combat terrorism was dead. 2017, they said that they finished the operation, was no longer a problem. And after the Caracas terror attacks in April of this year, a few days after, Putin came forward, and mind you, this is a terror attack where like 140 people died, where they were all shot in very shoddy fashion. If you watch the footage of these terrorists, they had no clue what they were doing. It looked like they were trying to throw the bullets at the people. What I mean by that is instead of just like aiming, and you're like waiting for the gun to readjust so they can fire the next shot, they were just like, and they were like almost throwing the rifle at the people they were shooting at, like they wanted to almost pitch the bullets towards the people. The guns were sparking. It looks like that they were made in some workshop somewhere. Not an extremely extravagant operation, but after shooting so many people and burning the whole facility to the ground, they killed like 140 people. They killed like 140 people. Now, how did the Russian government react to this? Well, the first thing they did was immediately blame Ukraine. They said it was Ukraine's fault, even though ISIS claimed the attack, and it certainly looked like an ISIS-K attack. It has all the markings of an ISIS attack. They were done by people from Dagestan, which is somewhere that ISIS has been building up presence. ISIS has a long-standing reason to have a beef with the Russians, not only for the suppression of Islamists within Russia itself or territories occupied by Russia, but also due to the fact that Russia fought ISIS in Syria. I mean, it was one of many countries that fought ISIS in Syria, but out of all the countries that fought ISIS in Syria outside of the Assad regime, the one that seems the most distracted and the one that seems like it has the most vulnerabilities and weaknesses right now, because let's say it's tied in foreign adventures, I guess is the way you could put it, seems to be the Russians. And so ISIS going after them in this manner should not be a tremendous surprise to us, especially if you know the history of ISIS's relationship with Russia, if you know the history of Russia's relationship with domestic grown Islamist extremism, or if you just look at Russia's position right now and why ISIS would consider attacking them over, say, other countries that could put the full force of their foreign policy concentration or security concentration on fighting terrorism instead of, again, forward adventures and conquests. Anyway, once the terror attack happened, there was two reactions. The first one was blaming it on Ukraine. The second one was everything's fine in Russia. Our domestic situation is great. Russia, and this is a direct quote from Vladimir Putin, a few days after over like 140 people were killed in a terror attack done by ISIS. Russia can't be a target of terrorist attacks by Islamic fundamentalists. We are a unique example of interfaith harmony. Now, not only is this ridiculous because of what's happening right now and what happened in Caracas a few days before he said it. So it was a ridiculous statement then because of just the immediate events surrounding it. And it's even more ridiculous now, considering after he said it, there's been more Islamist terror attacks. But if you just know the history of the Soviet Union and Muslim minorities, then the idea that they've, always been a place of interfaith harmony is nonsense. If you know the history of the Russian Empire and what they did to religious minorities and Muslim communities, and the Tatars in Crimea, for example, you would know this is a bunch of horse hockey nonsense. But it's especially horse hockey because all you need to do is turn on the TV and see the terror attacks and be like, oh, that Orthodox priest that got shot in the south of Dagestan, I don't think that's exactly the best symbol of interfaith harmony. I don't know if shooting a priest is a good symbol of that. I personally would say no. 20 dead, including a priest, 15 police officers. Not exactly the symbol of interfaith harmony that Putin was advertising to the world right after the Caracas terror attacks. Now, maybe right after those terror attacks, Putin could have gotten away with saying that if nothing else happened. And it would already be a bad thing to follow that up with. But it doesn't seem to be the case that it's letting up. Now, why is it that ISIS, and right now we don't know for sure who's claiming the attacks, but it certainly looked like an Islamist attack. It had all the call signs of ISIS-K. There's a good chance that ISIS-K in the very near future is going to claim this, or a similar Islamist group. And can I just say, if it's a different Islamist group, I don't necessarily think that would be a good thing for the Russians. That would necessarily be a terrible thing for the Russians, because then they're not just dealing with one active terrorist group doing large-scale terror attacks in Russia. They're dealing with two large-scale terrorist groups, one of which is doing coordinated terror attacks across multiple cities at the same time. And I will say that it is also possible because, you know, Dagestan also has its own history of Islamist extremism separate from ISIS. So I think one of the reasons why these types of Islamic extremists might be striking now, and I said this earlier, is because Russia is in an incredibly vulnerable place. Vladimir Putin, many people might not remember this, and I was young at the time too. Well, actually, I was not existent at the original time when he first got in there. Putin got into power originally on a wave of anti-Islamic extremism, anti-terrorism. We need a strong man to go in there and crush them and bring stability to the Ruski Mir. That was the wave he was elected on as the stability choice when he was reelected, after he was moved up from vice president to president by Yeltsin. And that was the mandate that he capitalized on to stay in power. And so if there was anything to like throw out as the Putin pitch, certainly early on in his career, it would be as the stability president. The stability president. And so while Putin is invading Ukraine and losing hundreds of thousands of Russians to the grinder, and is losing tons of military resources, losing foreign investment, losing foreign capital, losing his own citizens, not only to the war, but to fleeing the country itself, spending a lot of their reserves, both when it comes to their, you know, just dollars that they have saved, but also when it comes to the gold that they've reserved over a very long time.
Immoral,
morally corrupt, bankrupt man. Thank you, Evil Prime, for the primer. I appreciate that. Thank you. And Russia's just main focus is overseas. Well, not overseas, technically. It's in Ukraine, in another country. And so if Russia's eye is not on the ball, while it has to invest more and more of its security resources into invading another country, and they have a pre-existing beef with organizations like ISIS and Islamists, and a large domestic Muslim population, many of which live in abject poverty and have many reasons to be irked by the central government in Moscow, those are not great conditions for stability, especially if those are the same communities you're going into and offering draft papers. And if they were to do another wave of mobilization, these would also be the communities that would most likely be hardest hit by another wave of mobilization. So I think that the ISIS or the Islamist terrorist groups that are doing this, whoever it might be, even though ISIS is definitely the top suspect, could see how Russia's distracted, could see its security investments, could see its weaknesses and its pre-existing beef with the organization, and is taking advantage of the opportunity. And this is the consequence, not to say that anyone deserves this, of course, but this is the consequence of you spending all of your money and time and all of your security investment on invading and conquering other countries instead of, say, I don't know, on security, on fighting extremism and terrorism that is meant to kill your civilian population. I mean, even though the Russians started this war under a mandate of we need to protect the Russian speakers, if they would have not invaded and just concentrated all their time on trying to thwart terror attacks like this, they would have not only saved all of the maybe been able to save Russian speakers at home, but they also would have been able to avoid killing all of the Russian speakers of the Donbass and in Kharkiv and in Kherson and in other places where they've bombed the smithereens, with the majority of the people being killed in this war being Russian speakers, because it is their communities where the violence has been concentrated. So I think this is just an example of Islamists taking advantage of a country that has weakened itself by purposely falling on the sword for jingoistic, nationalistic, and geopolitical reasons that baffle the senses. Now, that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that's probably why ISIS is doing this. So what is the Russian government going to do in response? Well, I don't know for sure, because the Russians have a problem, and they have a problem they cannot be publicly honest about. And if you cannot be publicly honest about the problem you have with terrorism, with who's causing these attacks, with who's planning these attacks, with who's executing these attacks, and you need to take every single bad thing that happens domestically in your country and blame it on the foreigner. Even though the people who did this attack, if you want to just understand how homegrown it was, Dagestani official sacked after sons implicated in Sunday's deadly attack. Russian officials blamed the West for slayings, following the same script used after the Crocus Hall attack. A local official in Russia's Dagestan region was sacked on Monday after 2 of his sons were reported to be among the gunmen. So this isn't people, oh, they smuggled or they kept some info. The gunmen were the children of Russian officials that were members of Putin's parties, that were regional governors for Dagestan. So the people in charge of regional governments. Regional governor Sergei Melnikov told journalists that the head of Dagestan's Sergokala district, Magomed Omarov, had been removed from his post without giving details on his connection to Sunday's attacks. His dismissal came as the death toll from the assaults climbed to at least 20. Anyway, point is, it's being painted very quickly as foreigners and largely being, I guess you can call, quote unquote, Ukraine coded. Oh, maybe the Ukrainians behind it. Oh, maybe it was a GUR. Oh, maybe it was Budanov and another. And all of these theories. And the problem is, if you can't be honest about what happened, which is that Russia has a history of problems with homegrown Islamic extremism. Well, they have a problem with homegrown extremism of every stripe, but also Islamist extremism. And this is an example of the state breaking down, living conditions breaking down, large amounts of drafting going on, and the relationship between Moscow and many of the territories to their east in the Caucasus no longer being so hunky-dory about the situation. And as the situation continues to deteriorate at home, and they continue to dump resources into this war over in Ukraine, there's weakness at home. And instead of investing in security resources at home, you're investing in another country. And this is the result of it. This is the result of it. But if they were honest about what happened, then the fingers could be turned at, wait a second, why are we invading this country if the point is to protect Russians when we're getting shot at home? When we're getting shot at home in shopping malls, when we're getting shot at home at our synagogues, at our churches, just walking down the street, our police officers are getting capped while driving down the street. What are we supposed to do as Russians if the main war here, the main war goal was protect Russia itself, and then Russia isn't protected? It creates a dilemma for the Russian government. And so, if you can connect it to Ukraine, then not only can you avoid this difficult conversation, which will make it harder to address the issue down the road, but just sweep it under the rug. What the problems like this spin out of control? Never heard of it before. Just sweep it under the rug and ignore it. That's how most problems go away. That's how most problems go away. And the other thing is, then you can help use this as war propaganda. Beat the drum using the corpses of the victims and their families as this emotional fodder to help create more corpses in another country and to make their families cry. That's one solution, not a solution to the problem of terrorism, which will continue to be a problem in Russia, no matter how many times Putin comes forward and talks about interfaith harmony, puts a crown of thorns on his head and says kumbaya, beats the drum and smokes the reefer. It doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter. As long as he continues to invest resources in fighting this war in Ukraine and neglects the situation at home, the situation will continue to deteriorate. And in fact, in some areas, even if they were to stop the war tomorrow, the situation would still probably continue to deteriorate before it gets better. And you can't expect organizations.
Dylan, have you considered that everything bad that happens in Russia is actually Ukraine's fault? Starting with resisting the invasion.
I hadn't thought about that. Now, Ukraine, by shooting back in resisting the Russians took more resources away from Russia, therefore enabling the terrorists. Therefore, Ukraine is ISIS, flawless object, Allahu Akbar, Ukraine. And can I just say, there is nothing more disrespectful to the victims of terrorism than to use their bodies as an op, create more corpses for more innocent civilians. Nothing more distasteful and disrespectful.